Hello, everybody. My name is Tony Heil. I am the Director of Communications and Public Policy at ALS United Mid-Atlantic. We serve people with ALS in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, and have been serving our ALS community since 1977 and growing to meet their needs through care, research, and advocacy. We are part of the wider ALS community. We are always partnering and collaborating with people who are joining us to advocate for our patients, to improve research, and to make sure that we're doing all we can to support everything involving ALS, including some of our friends from I Am ALS. And I'm recording this for Brain Week in March 2025. So I'm really excited to branch out and talk to these new friends from I Am ALS, learn about some of their programs with the community outreach team, and we'll explore some topics that can talk about how patients and caregivers can be empowered because you, our patients, are the most powerful part of our mission. I'm joined today by Tim Abeska, Cristy Hardin, and Deb Winters. I think we'll all be friends in the end. And if not, well, that's going to be my fault. But I think we'll all get along pretty well because we're all here to serve our ALS community. Tim, you are the co-chair of the I Am ALS Community Outreach Team. Cristy is a community organizing associate who understands a lot of empowering people through advocacy. And Deb is living with ALS. So you all have an important perspective here. But we'll start with Tim. Tim, thank you for joining, and please tell us a little bit about your role.
So I got involved with I Am ALS and ALS advocacy after losing my wife a little over 6 years ago to ALS. She was an Air Force veteran. I co-chair the community outreach team, which engages and educates the community about ALS and raises awareness. And I coordinate the logistics for the many, many panels we present as part of the Tim Lowrey Panel Series, which is our flagship enterprise to educate health science students and medical professionals about ALS.
And I've been reading about the Tim Lowrey Series. I've seen more online about it. Can you give me a little bit of a description of what that exactly means to educate the ALS community?
Well, there are some things that you can't learn in a textbook. And we developed the Tim Lowrey Panel Series named after a fellow volunteer named Tim Lowrey, who has ALS, who was a pharmacist before he had to stop working because of the disease, and had a passion for educating medical professionals and students with the hope that they would be, when they get in practice and see someone exhibiting symptoms or encounter someone who has the disease, that they would be in a better position to empathize with and treat those people. So this panel series started small, and because of the work of numerous volunteers, including Cristy and Deb, has exploded. We did 45 panels last year. We have already presented 12 this year. We are presenting 4 next week, several more this month, and we are touching a lot of students.
So with that, going to medical school, obviously you learn about basics and important information about medicine. What are some of the more important things people learn from this series that you think is very valuable? Because you mentioned about empathy and understanding, because ALS is such a unique disease with so many issues. But what do you think that people are learning about this from this, especially in the medical community?
One of the things would be what the telltale symptoms of the disease are, because ALS is a diagnosis of exclusion,
Mm-hmm.
and the symptoms are often confused with other illnesses. We know of people who have had one or more surgeries for things like carpal tunnel, uh, a disc in their back or something, because they don't get to neurologists soon enough and their doctors don't really understand what the disease is. I think Deb can talk a little bit about her own misdiagnosis experience. And prompt diagnosis is so important, not only from the standpoint of maximizing your life before you are unable to do certain things, but also eligibility for clinical trials. Because
Yes.
if you're too far along in the disease, you're not going to be eligible for trials, and potentially lose out on the ability to be treated with drugs that can short slow the progression of symptoms, and give you more time until we find a cure for this terrible disease.
Well, Deb, that's a really good transition to your story. And sorry to pass over you, Christian. We'll talk with you in a second. But Deb, I would be very interested in hearing about your diagnosis story and what brought you to this advocacy.
I will give you the cliff notes because there's a time limit on this, but it took over 14 months for me to get a diagnosis. I had a total reverse shoulder replacement in that process. I saw three different, well, I ended up with a neurologist whose specialty is neuromuscular diseases. I saw two neurologists prior to that. On one of the tests, it came back with results of that the diagnosis of exclusion was metastatic myeloma cancer. And so we went through all of that process as well. And it started with some random falls, and I couldn't open doorknobs. My hand wouldn't grasp the doorknob to open it. And it was actually my physical therapist who noticed what has been termed ALS hand and got me started on the journey.
And so when you finally got that diagnosis, did it make sense to you and your caregiving team, your family, once you understood the symptoms? Was it something you had thought about, or was it a big surprise?
The good news is, at least at some level, is that the other doctors along the way had said, we are concerned about. And so I had heard ALS prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
There's always hope for something besides the ALS diagnosis, but it did make sense. And yes, I had heard those words prior to the definitive diagnosis.
And as you work with people like Tim and Cristy and others, what do you hope to do with educating people through sharing your story? Do you want to help to make it easier to diagnose, or to be asking certain questions? What are some of your goals as a person living with this disease?
Certainly, I want people to know that you don't go home and prepare to die, number one. That there is, as long as my grandfather would say, you're on the green side of the sod, you have stuff that you can do. And so I would encourage everyone to make sure, double check, and find your purpose for the days that are given to you. That if we keep ALS a secret, nothing is going to change. And for those of us who can still speak loud, raise your hand, let others know that this is a topic that needs to be addressed.
And Cristy, you are a community organizer associate. And I think for someone like you or Tim or myself who's not living with ALS, it's like one of our jobs is to give that bullhorn to someone like Deb and empower them. So tell me a little bit about what your role is in this activity.
So I actually joined IMALS last January in 2023 as a volunteer after being a caregiver for one of a dear friend of mine who was living with ALS, and I got involved in all of the things right alongside with Tim and Deb, and I was lucky enough to be offered a position here in August of last year. So essentially what my role is, I'm kind of like a project manager. I support all of the initiatives that people like Tim and Deb and we have over 250 community volunteers who step in to help our initiatives, and one of the big things I do is help Tim support his initiatives within the community outreach team. I also work with several of our other teams. We've got groups that are focused on Black and minorities. We've got groups that one of the other groups that Tim leads is our Veterans Affairs team. We have a writing group. We've got a legislative affairs team, clinical trials team. So I work across the board to support the initiatives and the work that the community members are doing. And, IMALS, prior to their coming on board about 5 years ago, there was little to no work being done in ALS research. And I also lead our Lou Gehrig Day team. And one of the things that always comes up is if Lou Gehrig was diagnosed with ALS today, he would have no better prognosis or diagnosis than he received over 80 years ago when he actually was diagnosed and passed from the disease, which is absolutely appalling, as we can imagine. And with the creation of IMALS, we have been able to help secure over $1 billion in funding and federal funding to help secure research, to drive new drugs. We've actually, since 2020, we've been very active in the legislative field. We've helped pass ALS Disability Insurance Acts. We've worked with the NIH research program to secure DoD research fundings. We've helped pass the Accelerating Access for Critical Therapies Acts. We've also, again, we work with hundreds of volunteers, and we do events and we do actions. And just in 2022 alone, we had over 7,000 participants in one or many of our events, which is part of our drive, is just getting that ALS awareness out there into the community, because ALS is very misunderstood, not only by the community, but also we've learned through the Tim Lowrey panels and through meeting folks like Deb who are living with ALS, that a lot of the doctors, neurologists, they just don't understand ALS. And so a lot of the work that we do is just simply to raise awareness, drive initiatives, drive Congress to make the right decisions, drive drug companies to help find those, hopefully one day a cure, but at least some relief for the patients in the interim.
Yeah, I know that we have here at ALS United Mid-Atlantic been working on advocacy and research for over 40 years. And it's nice that we have a broad swath of ALS organizations that now we're collaborating with at a greater level than ever before. We're talking with IMALS and our friends at ALS United Network and greater on things like the Cures Collective and other things to really make sure we're sharing more stories. And we're happy to see things pass like Act for ALS that we help to participate in the advocacy for that. We all have our advocates and champions, whether it's this in Congress or as patients, and we're going to continue that. We're glad to see some new drugs that have been approved over the last decade, but there's no one drug that's good enough yet, and we need to keep fighting for that. So, Tim, tell me a little bit about what this series is and what you would like other people to know about the Tim Lowrey Series.
So the way the panel works, most of the meetings or most of the panels are done by Zoom. Occasionally, we have volunteers who are close geographically to where the presenting school or fire station or library is, and we'll have one or two people go there personally. But we have a moderator who begins the panel with a 10-minute or so slideshow presentation about what ALS is, what the symptoms are, the difference between random or sporadic ALS and familial ALS, the treatment situation, the diagnosis process, and depending upon who the audience is, we sometimes will have slides that are specially focused, for example, to physical therapists or speech therapists or medical students. And then after that presentation, the moderator engages our panelists through a Q&A to talk about their personal experiences. And we, along the way, invite audience questions to be put into the chat. We always have a chat monitor because it's very important, especially for some people living with ALS who use assistive technology to communicate, that their comments be read out to everybody. And no question is off limits. Sometimes people are very skittish about asking certain questions because you are dealing with a disease that we know ends, unfortunately, in the passing of the person. But no questions are off limits. Our panelists are extraordinary, and they will talk about anything. And we're not worried about privacy. What we're all about is educating people. And we get some terrific comments. I'm just going to read one to you from someone who was an audience member. This was a very impactful experience. It is one thing to learn about this disease in a class where we do labs and assignments to better understand its science, but it is another thing to have a personal conversation with someone who is suffering from it. I got to hear the real life experiences of others and build personal connections with them. It made ALS that more real for me. And that is what we are trying to do.
I appreciate that. I think that a lot of us have learned to try to do that in various forms if we're working on the ALS cause, whether it's through events or through our social workers and nurses and at clinics. Deb, I'd like to ask you again, what does it mean to be part of an ALS community? I imagine when you were diagnosed, you may not have known a lot of people living with ALS in your personal life, right?
Well, not a lot, but I had a dear friend who lost her husband a year before I was diagnosed with ALS. And so community for me is incredibly important, that understanding that you're not alone, that you can talk to others who you don't have to explain to, who get what you're saying. To piggyback on what Tim said, one of the panels that we did was for a group of people in pastoral education and learning to be chaplains. And what I didn't tell you, my title is Reverend. I was a pastor for a number of years before having to step down from my congregation after being diagnosed. And that gift of being able to have a relationship with others that are going through the same thing that you're going through, to be able to explain to pastors, to chaplains, that there are so many, ALS affects so many parts of your life. It affects every part of your life, as you're aware of. And to be able to address those parts, that communication is important, that words are important, and that community makes a huge difference.
I agree that community makes a big difference. And I imagine that through your relationship, through your church and your congregation, you hopefully received a lot of love from them, but also you want to talk to someone, like you said, who they're not just compassionate and caring, but they understand what you're going through. So it's a different kind of connection.
Exactly. And the good news and the bad news, you're right. I received huge amounts of love and prayers from my congregation. But when you receive the diagnosis, now you're telling your family, your biological family, you're telling your church family, and it just, that emotional impact, telling my 88 and 89-year-old parents that their daughter has a terminal disease is incredibly difficult. And for them to be part of the support system, not for me, but they need support as well. And so when you can bring awareness and education to more people, all of us benefit.
Cristy, as she's talking and as you explained your role, that does remind me of what diversity means when it comes to ALS, is that we have a lot of different ways that this disease can impact us. My grandfather was a veteran with ALS, and when he had ALS 20 years ago, we didn't know about the service-connected connection, and you brought that up. So as you build those community connections, I'm sure that's part of your job is just looking at the different diverse connections that people have to this disease, and which can be a variety of things, right?
Yes, so we actually have a group of community members called the Many Shades of ALS, and it's our Black and African American led group. It's got a couple Hispanic folks and just underrepresented community members, and that's the kind of the support group for them where they can come together and say, we need to raise awareness, because what we're learning is that Black and African Americans are, by and large, last to be diagnosed with ALS. And someone shared in the most recent meeting that he was told when his wife was going through the diagnosis process by his neurologist or her neurologist, oh, she can't possibly have ALS. Black women do not get ALS. And so it's just going back to our statement before, it's just this misinformation, miseducation that we're trying to help raise awareness for, that ALS does not discriminate against any race, gender, color of skin. And so just raising that awareness. And one of the initiatives this team is doing is putting together a pamphlet that they hope to put in the ALS clinics to help educate not only the other patients who come in to say, hey, you have a community. There are people out here like you that are living with this disease, but to also help educate the medical professionals that they're working with to help them understand that, yes, again, this disease does not discriminate. So we are pushing a lot of initiatives just to get that out. And we mentioned earlier that we've got the clinical trials, which is a big push right now. And these minorities and these underrepresented individuals and in lower and poorer class communities don't have access to the same treatment that people in more affluent areas, not only because the clinical trials are not available, but there's clinics not available. So again, just raising that awareness that everybody needs treatment, everybody needs some kind of community. And so we also have within our organization, we've got our community support side, that we have groups for people to come together that they can share their experiences. We are working on a peer mentor and peer support initiative where we partner somebody like Deb who's living with ALS. She's had it for a number of years. We'll find somebody who might be newly diagnosed that has no idea how to transverse the land of dealing with ALS. I'm on the peer mentor side where I would be partnered with somebody who's caregiving as a non-family member. So just providing that community support and education to folks who are new to this landscape.
And taking a long time to be diagnosed, as Deb was explaining her story, if you're from an underrepresented group and people are not expecting that you have ALS because that group in their mind, if they're a neurologist or other kind of doctor, they don't see that. And hopefully we don't have that from our doctors. We have a great relationship with our clinics. That's why we have them. But that hurts people like me because I am a white male and my grandfather had ALS and I want a cure for my family. It's not familial. We don't have any of that. We've had only one case, but the fewer people who are in clinical trials, that means the longer it takes to get treatments, right? So the more people who can get diagnosed sooner, the better off we all are. And that's kind of what we're looking at here, right?
Yep, exactly.
And Tim, you talked about the Tim Lowrey series and the many of things that they bring up in that series, and one of them was empathy. I imagine from what Cristy was saying and even from Deb's experience, taking a long time to be diagnosed and the frustration that goes through that, that empathy that you hear in those conversations must be very important to teach to young medical professionals so that they can better diagnose and treat people in the future.
It is. One of the things we talk about is how to interact with patients when you are in a treatment setting or in a home setting. For example, sometimes people shout at the person living with ALS,
Mm-hmm.
mistakenly thinking they can't understand something. And we emphasize that the person hasn't changed, the person's still there. It's just their muscles don't work. And you need to treat them with the same kind of human dignity that you would treat anybody else with. and you don't stand over their wheelchair and talk down to them. You sit down next to them and you look them in the eye and you talk to them and converse with them and you talk to them. You don't funnel everything through the caregiver while the person's sitting, right there in the same room. And I would like to mention, because I know we're getting toward the end of our time, the community outreach team has its fingers, if you will, into a lot of different things. We have one team member who um, oversees an Artistry of ALS project where people living with ALS showcase their works of art in a virtual gallery, and the artists are interviewed as part of this program. We have another team member whose wife was significantly affected by misdiagnosis, and that's his passion. He goes to medical conferences and sets up a booth and has brochures about, you know, the perils of misdiagnosis, the symptoms that indicate it could be ALS. We have another team member who is putting on a car show this summer. And last but not least, when you said empathy, I thought of Deb because she's got this great empathy dinner concept where you bring people together for a dinner, and she can tell you more, but when they walk into the room, they're given a card that says, "This is your ALS symptom tonight. You can't speak, you can't move your hands, you can't walk, whatever it might be." And boy, I mean, it really raises awareness, all of these things.
Well, Deb, that's a very good transition. How has that empathy dinner worked for you? And I imagine your background in the clergy really helps you because you can't do that job successfully if you are not able to empathize with your congregation. So I imagine that being able to empathize is the most important skill that you have had and nurtured for years before ALS came into your life.
Well, yes, I'd like to believe that. And I'm just going to say, as Tim said, the impact of a empathy dinner is overwhelming often for the people who come. Last year we had one man who was supposed to come with his wife, his soon-to-be wife. He was 2 weeks before his wedding, and she couldn't come, so he brought his soon-to-be stepdaughter, 13 years old. And the symptom that he got was that he couldn't feed himself. And so to hear him speak later about what impact it was to be humble enough to allow his 13-year-old to cut his food and feed him was incredible. Another woman who couldn't speak wrote on her whiteboard, "Hard to make friends when you can't say anything."
Mm-hmm.
And so that is that's a public ability to be able to be impactful the same way the Lowrey panels are with medical students, to be able to see ALS in person, if you will, is so much more impactful than any book or any article or any website or anything other than real life.
Well, I really appreciate that, Deb. And as we finish up here, you've said a lot of important things already, but is there any final message you want to send to the ALS community, the people who are living with ALS, about the importance of joining the ALS community, of branching out and making those connections, because you know how scary a diagnosis is, whether you're a person living with the disease or a caregiver. So just want to hear your message of encouragement to others so that they can feel more welcome to participate in whatever way they want.
I would say that the IMALS community teams offer people living with ALS, their families, current former caregivers, a chance to meld with other people in the same circumstances. We are more like a family than an organization. We love each other, and we will do whatever anybody needs at the time they need help. And if anybody's listening to this podcast who is a student in the medical field, who is a medical professional, who wants to know more about a Lowrey panel and have one presented to their organization, We have a website where you can go to request a panel, and I would encourage you to do that.
And I
And
would
Deb,
also
anything you want to add to that as a person living with ALS?
I would like to add that we are not meant to live this life alone.
Mm-hmm.
And ALS can make you feel very alone. So the king has one more move, and there is always hope. Reach out.
Yeah. And Cristy, anything you want to add to the importance of community?
Yeah, I would just say that when I was the caregiver, I did not have a community. I was isolated and by myself. I didn't understand the intricacies of ALS. But when I plugged in with this community, I felt just like Tim said, I felt like I was welcomed by a family. And it's so important to make those connections because you're going through something unique. Losing a family member to another disease, such as cancer, which is equally as horrible, is a very different experience than going through losing somebody or living with ALS. And so I would say, take the time to get plugged into an ALS community in your area, whether it's us or another one. But we will certainly welcome you here. We have a community support group that we can plug folks into at gethelp@imals.org. And we will welcome you, as Tim said, with open arms as part of our family.
We will love on you.
Well, I appreciate you all sharing your perspectives, and I'll put a link in the description to the Tim Lowrey series so people can learn more. And we are always looking for ways to educate and empower the ALS community. As always, if you want to learn more about our organization, it's www.alsmidatlantic.org, and we will connect to this series as well in our description in this video and on the Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. So listen and subscribe for more stories. Thank you, Deb, Tim, and Cristy. We appreciate it, and we look forward to supporting the ALS community together in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.